Okay, good morning, everybody. Good morning, Dr. Paul Harris. Thank you for being with us. Today, I'm so happy. We're so happy to have you here once again. We hope that next time will be in person. Greetings to the people who are connected directly or who are listening to us throughout our YouTube channel. The conference title is Missing Persons. Our guest is the Dr. Paul Harris from Harvard University. He is psychologist and he has a PhD in psychology, specifically in experimental psychology from Oxford University. He has a lot of publications such as journals, articles, chapters, and of course, lots of books. He is interested in early development of cognition, emotion, and also imagination. Well, the dynamic will be as follows. You have, Doctor, 40 minutes more or less for the conference, and then you will have 20 minutes for questions. If someone has questions during the conference, please write them down and ask them in the space provided for it at the end. Doctor, do you have any question?
I'm fine, thank you.
Okay, so thank you so much once again.
All right, so as you've just heard, this talk is about missing persons, and I'm going to tell you about the way in which children maintain connections, emotional connections to people who were not actually present. Here's an overview of the topics I'll discuss. I'm going to begin with attachment theory, which is probably the most important theory of emotional development in child psychology. But I want to switch or emphasize a disagreement between the main protagonist or founder of attachment theory, John Bowlby, and a colleague of his called James Robertson, which I think means that there's a limitation to attachment theory with respect to this theme that I've just mentioned, namely the way in which children can keep in mind people who are not with them. And then I'll switch rather abruptly. Excuse me, I'm going too quickly here. Let me go back a little bit. Children can also think about people who are not only absent, but have died. And that means that I'll be telling you about children's conception of death and their beliefs in an afterlife. So let's get going by talking about attachment theory. My starting point is the situation in London hospitals in the early 1950s. And if you look at this chart, you'll see that children who were admitted to hospital were facing a difficult situation because their parents could only visit them for perhaps 1 or 2 hours per week. And in some circumstances, parents were not allowed to visit at all, or they could only come to look at the children through a partition, often while the children were asleep. So these children were abruptly separated from their parents and had to cope with the absence of those reassuring caregivers. The reason for this was a medical one. The hospital authorities were nervous about the transmission of infection. And so in their eyes, these measures, these rather severe measures, were justified, but they didn't really take into account the emotional toll on the children in question. So at this point, 2 important figures. Here's a picture of John Bowlby, as I mentioned, the founding father of attachment theory, and his collaborator, James Robertson, here on the right, and his wife, Joyce Robertson. And if you look carefully at the photograph, you'll see that James is holding a camera, and indeed this played an important part in his research with Bowlby, because he went into hospitals and filmed children's reactions to this separation. So, having made a film in the early 50s, which was called A 2-Year-Old Goes to Hospital, excuse me again, he showed the film to a meeting of the British Psychoanalytic Society. And a week later, Bowlby, his colleague, discussed the interpretation of this film again at the British Psychoanalytic Society. Now, Bowlby had been trained in psychoanalysis, but his interpretation of the emotional distress faced by the hospitalized child didn't actually invoke psychoanalytic concepts. And to some extent, his interpretation met with resistance on the part of the more classically trained or devoted psychoanalytic clinicians at the meeting. But eventually, the presentation and the accompanying film were discussed in several papers that were published in the Psychoanalytic Study of the Child, which is and remains an important journal for psychoanalytic approaches to child development. And I want to call your attention to one particular contribution. Some of you may recognize this young woman. Well, the young woman in the left-hand photograph, somewhat older in the right-hand photograph. I think the left-hand photograph was taken in Vienna. The right-hand photograph will have been taken in London. And that gives you the clue that this is a picture of Anna Freud, Freud's daughter, who was indeed a specialist of child development, attempting to apply her father's ideas to the child's emotional development. And in her commentary on the findings of Bowlby and Robertson, she made some thoughtful comments about the difficulty of interpreting exactly why a child would be distressed when in hospital. So she pointed out that the children, when they're in hospital, are first of all separated from their primary caregiver. Of course, typically that would be their mother, although not necessarily. But secondly, not only are they separated from their primary caregiver, they're in a strange physical environment. The hospital environment, after all, does not much resemble an ordinary home, and it's rarely a place that the child will have visited before. So it's unusual and unfamiliar. But third, and perhaps especially important, Anna Freud pointed out that often when a child is separated from the primary caregiver, the mother, for example, they will spend time with another familiar caregiver, maybe their father, maybe a grandfather, possibly an older sibling. But in the case of these children in hospital, there was no opportunity to seek reassurance from such a familiar alternative caregiver. Rather, the child was looked after by a sequence of nurses, none of whom would have had the time and regularity to make a relationship with this child. So she said, given these three factors, the cause of the child's distress is unclear. Well, some years later, faced with these questions about the causes of distress, Joyce and James Robertson decided to do an intervention study in which they would factor out or try to look at the various factors that might be contributing. And in particular, they thought that they would look at the child who had been separated from his or her mother, but had access to somebody who was trusted and who was familiar. So the design of the study, it was a very small scale study involving only 4 children, but the design was straightforward and clear. Joyce Robertson got to know each of 4 children, knowing that in the next few weeks, the child's mother was about to go into hospital herself. So the child would be separated from her mother. Having got to know these children, the Robertsons took the child into their own home and looked after the child in the absence of the mother. So here we have children separated from their primary caregiver, but unlike the hospital situation, they have access to a familiar caregiver. And what they found was that under these circumstances, all 4 of the children, coped well with the separation. They didn't show the classic sequence of protest, despair, and detachment, which had often been observed among the hospitalized children, and especially important when the mother came out of hospital and was reunited with the child's bond with their mother was quickly reestablished, whereas some of the hospitalized children took time to readjust to reunion with their mother, turning away from her, showing avoidance. So the main conclusion that the Robertsons reached was that the availability of a familiar alternative, caregiver forestalled the distress that's normally observed among hospitalized children. So good news, in some sense, they had found a way to mitigate separation anxiety. But interestingly, John Bowlby was reluctant to accept the conclusions that the Robertsons had reached. And indeed, if you look at his book, this is one of the 3 books that he wrote about attachment theory called Separation. When he reviews the Robertsons' findings, he carefully underlines whatever occasional upset each of the 4 children displayed. And in fact, there was an exchange of letters between John Bowlby and James Robertson that shows an increasing tension between the 2 men. 2 Dutch historians, Van der Horst and Van der Veer, have done this historical digging and uncovered this rather severe disagreement between the 2 men. Now, this was not a temporary problem or a temporary quarrel. Robertson eventually wrote that I have long had reservations as to the uses to which you have put my early institutional findings, and my reservations are strengthened by the findings of our current project, Young Children in Brief Separation. That current project is the 4 children I just talked about. Soon after this letter was sent, the correspondence between the 2 men stopped, and the breach between them was never repaired. And in fact, this quarrel, if we can call it that, went beyond the grave, so to speak, because in 1990, after John Bowlby had died, Mary Ainsworth came to London to deliver a eulogy, an address, a memorial eulogy about Bowlby's work. But by this time, James Robertson had died too, but his wife, Joyce, was still alive, and she insisted that her late husband should not be mentioned in this memorial eulogy delivered by Mary Ainsworth, one of Bowlby's foremost collaborators. So we're not talking about a passing disagreement between 2 researchers about how best to interpret their data. We're talking about a fundamental and what appears to be an emotionally charged disagreement. One that I may say is not really discussed within attachment theory. So you might say to me, well, why are you digging up this old quarrel? What's the point of doing that? Well, I think there are a couple of reasons for re-examining what happened here. First of all, Bowlby's view not the Robertson's view. Bowlby's view ended up dominating attachment theory. Here's a statement, an opening statement by a leading attachment researcher, Jude Cassidy, published in 2016. And as you can see from the way she phrases it, she implies that Bowlby and Robertson were in agreement that children experience intense distress when they're separated from their mothers. But as I've just shown you, Robertson dissented firmly from that opinion and said it all depends what alternative caregivers are available. The other important reason for thinking about this more carefully is that those of you who know attachment theory, and particularly the strange situation, which is often used to measure a child's attachment to their mother, will recognize that the hospital situation and its characteristics are echoed in the strange situation. That's to say, the child is separated from the mother. The child is in an unfamiliar physical environment, one that they've not been in before. And thirdly, they're either left alone or they're left with a stranger. In other words, there's no familiar caregiver with them whilst their mother leaves the room. So given the Robertson's findings, the implication is that the child's reaction would be very different if the child in the strange situation were left not alone or with an unfamiliar person, a stranger, but rather with a familiar caregiver. And in fact, to some extent, running counter to the findings in attachment theory, there was a series of studies conducted primarily in the United States in the 1970s, which showed that if one parent left, but another parent stayed, the child rarely got upset and continued to play. On the other hand, if the child was left with a stranger while the parent left, that did indeed lead to crying and play was disrupted. So summing up, this quarrel highlights the fact that we can't really be sure what is happening within the strange situation of attachment theory, because there are several disparate factors which are put together, and we can't be sure which is the key factor driving the child's emotional reaction. So just to summarize, when separated from an attachment figure, children do not always show distress at that separation. Their distress is reduced considerably, if not abolished, if they are left with somebody who's familiar. And this raises an interesting question, which I'm now going to turn to, which is, well, if the child is separated from one caregiver, but relatively comfortable within the care of a second caregiver, do they think and talk about the caregiver who's absent, who's not there? And that's what I'm going to discuss next. So this question belongs to a bigger issue, really, in language and cognitive development, which is the question of when children are able to think about events, phenomena, people who were not, as it were, in front of their very eyes, but belong elsewhere, so-called decontextualized phenomena. Now, a lot of research on this topic has studied the question of whether children can talk about decontextualized phenomena which occurred in the past or which might occur in the future. But that leaves unanswered the question of whether children can talk about decontextualized phenomena which are taking place perhaps at the moment, but are temporarily removed from the context of the child's utterance. So in a couple of recent papers, I, together with collaborators, have been looking at this basic question, do young children talk about people who are not there? So the two studies are slightly different, but they overlap. One was with 3 Mandarin-speaking children. The other was with 4 English-speaking children. And as you can see, they involve young children ranging from 20 months up to, in the case of the second study, about 5 years of age. So the children's language had been recorded when they were at home with a family member, such as a parent or a grandparent, but also in contexts where other members of the family might be absent. So the child might be looked after by a grandparent while the mother was away, or the child might be looked after by the mother while the father was away, and so forth. So we were able to ask then how often children mentioned another person by name, whether the person was present or absent. And then we could subdivide those mentions into 2 types. Was the person present during the conversation, or was the person absent during the conversation? And here are the findings from the 2 studies, with the Mandarin children on the left and the English-speaking children on the right. And as you can see, I've listed here the number of references per hour. So with respect to people who are present, we're seeing references every couple of minutes. Here, the darker bars are the references to absent people. And you can see that across ages and across the Mandarin and English-speaking children, we have a rather stable outcome, namely that the children talk about somebody who's not there about 8 or 9 or 10 times per hour. So this is not a rare phenomenon. The child who's left with one person, say the grandmother, is inclined to talk about somebody who's not there, be it the mother or the father or the grandfather and so forth. So clearly young children face separation with, in some sense, cognitive emotion and emotional resources, because they're able to think about and keep in mind this other familiar caregiver who temporarily is unavailable to them. So we took a closer look at these data in the sense that we said, well, is the child mentioning the missing parent or the missing grandfather because somebody in the room has mentioned that person? In other words, is the child just responding to a conversation partner's mention of a missing person? Alternatively, is the child spontaneously thinking about somebody who is not there? So we could divide the child's references to missing persons into 2 types. Fully spontaneous, namely those references that had not been preceded by a reference by the conversation partner, and less than fully spontaneous. Here's the number of fully spontaneous references, and you can see that about 4 or 5 times per hour, the child is talking about somebody who's not there, and the child is doing that spontaneously. It's not as if somebody else in the room has mentioned this missing person. It's the child who starts talking about the missing person. We carried out a more fine-grained analysis, and we asked a couple of questions. Well, who exactly are these missing persons? And how exactly do children talk about the missing person? Do they do it in a slightly emotionally charged or contact-related fashion? Or alternatively, do they do it in a more reflective or neutral fashion? So let's take a look at the results for those 2 questions. Unsurprisingly, most of the references to missing persons are references to family members as opposed to friends or as opposed to other people. So as we might expect, the child is inclined to talk about people who probably serve as caregivers, but are temporarily absent. We also see an age change in the sense that at first, among these younger children, when they're around the age of 2, or just a little bit older than 2, a lot of their mentions of the absent person are what I've called contact related rather than reflective. And by the time the child is a little bit older, around the age of 3 or 3 and a little bit, we see that the dominant mode is reflective. So just to give you some indication of what I mean by contact related, I mean when the child is clearly expressing attachment related concerns. For example, the child says, I want my daddy to come home, or the child repeats the name of a particular person, daddy, 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 or the child asks about the location of a particular person, where is daddy? So just going back, as I just explained, the contact-related references are especially frequent at the earlier ages, but as the child gets older, they become, as it were, more neutral, less contact oriented. Finally, well, there's the breakdown of desires, vocatives, and locatives. And as you can see, all 3 types are most noticeable among the younger children, less noticeable as the child gets older. Okay, so let's summarize where we are. Very young children often talk spontaneously, I emphasize spontaneously, about absent persons. This talk, it could be said, is an early but somewhat neglected example of so-called decontextualized talk. Decontextualized in the sense that the child is talking about a phenomenon is not in front of them, visible, but absent. And we see that children are especially likely to talk about family members, and initially at least in a contact-related fashion, but as they get older, in a more neutral fashion. So my broader conclusion from these analyses is that you and I, as adults, are inclined to think about our social network. We have a list of people on our cell phone whom we intermittently connect with, or perhaps repeatedly connect with. But of course, given that we use our cell phone, those people are not with us, but we can conjure them up in our mind's eye, and our network may consist of 7, 8, 20, 30, 50 people, depending upon the kind of person we are. What these data show, I think, is that this construction of a social network that is carried around in the head, so to speak, is already underway when a child is around 24 months, if not earlier, at 20 months. The child is beginning to be able to think about people who are not there. They're beginning to create a mental social network. Okay, I'm now going to switch rather abruptly to what seems like an unrelated topic, and that's children's ideas about death. So if you think about the way in which children are presented with death by adults, there are, broadly speaking, 2 different types of framing. On the one hand, children will be presented with a biological account of death, but they'll also be presented, depending upon their family and their community, with an account of death which sees it not as a terminus, but as a transformation, the beginning of a new form of life. Our question was whether children begin to adopt both of these different conceptions, and to what extent they coexist in the child's mind, and to what extent one framework comes to dominate the child's thinking over the other. So I did this research some time ago with Marta Gimenez in Madrid. And I should explain, of course, that because this was in Madrid and done in Spanish, it was not me doing the interviews, it was Marta. And she gave the children 2 different stories. Each of the stories involved a grandparent who had died. And she asked the children, once the grandparent had died, what about their various mental and bodily processes? So, for example, she might ask them of the grandfather, well, so now he's dead, have his eyes stopped working? Or a more mental question, now that he's dead, can he still see? And these questions were repeated for the 2 stories, the one about the grandfather, the one about the grandmother. And there were a variety of questions, not just about seeing, but about remembering, thinking, feeling emotion, and so forth. And in answering these questions, children would typically say yes or no and offer a justification. And we analyze their answers in terms of this combination of answer plus justification. So, for example, if the child is asked about the continuation of a particular process and says something like, well, in heaven, everything can work, even if she is dead, or yes, she can still see because the soul keeps working, we would deem that, understandably, I think, to be a religious answer. The child is invoking the idea of the continuity of that mental process or that bodily process. But we also got pretty straightforwardly biological answers. So the child might be asked, so can the grandfather still see now that he's dead? And the child would say, no, he's been eaten by worms, he has no body, he just has bones. Or if he's dead, nothing can work. So I think you can see that these answers are pretty clearly different. And we asked ourselves, well, how often do younger children and older children offer these kinds of answers? Religious on the one hand and biological on the other. And more importantly, we asked, is a given child consistently inclined to give you, say, biological answers and not give religious answers, or the reverse? Or do we see children sometimes giving biological and sometimes giving religious answers? So, summarizing, across the 2 stories and all the interview questions, did children give consistently biological replies, or did they give consistently religious replies, or did they give us a mix of biological and religious replies? Here are the findings, and you can see that I've split them into the 7-year-olds and the 11-year-olds, and the black bars are the proportion or the percentage of children who gave consistently biological answers. And what you can see here is that consistently biological answers is characteristic of most of the 7-year-olds. So we have about nearly 2/3 of them giving consistently biological answers. Now, it's not the case that when children get older, when they become 11, they give consistently religious answers. In other words, we see a slight increase between 7 and 11 with respect to these religious answers. But the more important age change is between the proportion or percentage of young children giving mixed replies and the proportion of 11-year-olds giving mixed replies. Now, summarizing then across these data, and I'm squishing together a rather large study, the key result is that as children get older, they increasingly think about death in terms of an afterlife. At the same time, as they do that, that conception of death sits alongside and is articulated by the very same child when answering a different question. In other words, by the time the child is 11, about 2/3 of them are showing what we might call a mixed or coexistent conception of death, in which they invoke, on the one hand, the fact that it terminates living processes, and on the other hand, the fact that it does not imply the termination or cessation of living processes, but there is continuity. Now, summarizing the points I've made then, I want to emphasize this: the religious account supplements the biological account, but without fully displacing it. In other words, the child operates with two different accounts. I may say that since we did that work in Spain, these findings have been replicated in other parts of the world, in Madagascar by Rita Astuti, an anthropological colleague, and myself, and also in Tanna, Vanuatu, by several colleagues at the University of Texas. So the results are stable. But now I think we have an interesting question then. Are afterlife beliefs simply a cultural narrative, perhaps promulgated by the religious leaders in that community, or are afterlife beliefs rooted more deeply in our psychological makeup? Are they based on the way we conceptualize those who are not with us, whether alive or dead? And in thinking about this, I was impressed by the following quotation from Proust in his long novel, In Search of Lost Time, à la recherche du temps perdu, which summarizes, I think, or captures in a very beautiful way the phenomenology of our reactions to the death of a loved one. So he says, people do not die for us immediately, but they remain bathed in a sort of aura of life which bears no relation to true immortality in the religious sense, he means, but through which these people continue to occupy our thoughts. And here's the line that particularly struck me: in the same way as when they were alive, it is as though they were traveling abroad. So in other words, Proust is saying, in ordinary life, we're used to thinking about people who are not there. And when somebody dies, this ability to think about somebody who is not there continues to echo in our thinking about this person who is now, as it were, permanently lost to us because they're dead. And he summarizes this by saying, it is a very pagan survival. And what he means by that, I think, is that this kind of psychological continuity is not something that we gain from religion, but something which is built into our way of thinking about absent people in general. And indeed, to some extent, the findings that I've shown you just now would endorse that, because we were finding the same afterlife beliefs in different cultures, including Madagascar, where Christian missionaries have not penetrated, so to speak, and where there's still worship of the ancestors rather than a belief in a Christian heaven. Now, I want you to think for a moment about how we talk about death in everyday life. In English, we often use various euphemisms. He is gone, she has passed away, she's in a better place, his family said goodbye, he has left this world, he's no longer with us. Our dear departed, she's been taken away from us. If you look at the phrasing in these various utterances, you can see that the implication is that death is a departure, it's an absence. The person is somewhere else, it's not that they've ceased to be. And I would invite you as Spanish speakers to come up with reflections on your own way of talking about death and the extent to which it portrays death indeed as a departure. I did some research of published papers on this, and I found that indeed there were linguists who had established that in Polish, Serbian, Spanish, Turkish, a Bantu language, and Formosan languages, and indeed in Mandarin, this talk of death as departure was actually quite noticeable. So let me now stop with some conclusions and try to knit the two parts of my talk together. So attachment theory, as I said at the beginning, in the hands of Bowlby in particular, focused primarily on negative, distressed reactions to separation. On the other hand, infants cope quite well when they're separated from one caregiver, but they have another caregiver to look after them. Their social circle, so to speak, remains more or less intact because one member of it only is absent. Nevertheless, when one member is absent, even from 24 months of age, children are good at keeping that absent person in mind. They spontaneously talk about him or her. Admittedly, with respect to death, children construct a biological conception of it as the endpoint to life. Nevertheless, in different parts of the world, children come to also construct a belief in an afterlife. And my speculative interpretation is that in different parts of the world, afterlife beliefs are rooted or grounded in what Proust referred to as a pagan or pre-religious conception of death, not as the endpoint, but as a departure to a different place. And my speculative interpretation then is that that conception probably reflects this early emerging capacity to think about absent members of our social network, which, as I've emphasized, is something that is available to young children even at 2 years of age. So let me stop there and open it up to questions from you. Meantime, I'll close down the PowerPoint or put it to one side. So I'm not sure how we're going to deal with the questions.
Okay, I'm here.
Okay, good.
Thank you so much, Dr. Harris. Does anyone have questions? If so, please raise your hand. No questions? Well, I think they don't have any questions. I do.
So why don't you start us off? Yes.
Okay, Dr. Harris. Well, thank you once again for sharing with us your knowledge. Throughout the conversation, most of the knowledge is related or was related with emotions. And emotion is the topic that I've been working or developing for the last 2 or 3 more or less years. So my question is, how do emotions help or hinder learning in children? In other words, how or do their beliefs help or hinder their learning processes?
Are you talking about emotions in general or emotions in the more narrow context that I've been talking about this morning?
I think in general terms.
Well, yes. So let me give you a brief comment on emotion or motivational research in developmental psychology and in education. So I do think there's, especially in the last 5 to 10 years, quite a lot of interest in emotion and motivation. We can think of people who emphasize so-called grit or a growth mindset, and the idea being that children who are well regulated and determined and persistent will be rather good pupils or better pupils than those who are less well regulated. I must admit, I'm not very enthusiastic about this line of research because it sort of implies that lots of children are not very well motivated, I suppose, and that seems a rather negative attitude. So when I say we, I mean myself and a doctoral student at Harvard have been doing some interesting research, or at least I find it interesting, on children's reading, especially their leisure time reading of storybooks. And certainly in the United States, there's a lot of anxiety about the reading level of children and the fact that they don't read very often. And this is often traced back to the motivational factors that I just mentioned, a lack of persistence, a lack of determination, and so forth. However, when my own children were young, we noticed that even the least enthusiastic reader, our middle son, when the first Harry Potter book was published, immediately became a very enthusiastic reader who could be absorbed for hours on end and had to be, as it were, pulled to the dinner table because otherwise he would just carry on reading. So what we've done in a recent study is to compare children who do read regularly and children who are more occasional readers. And we say to them, I want you to think about a book that you really enjoyed reading. And then we ask the children various questions about the experience of reading an interesting and exciting book. And the most exciting result is that all the children, whether they read 2 or 3 books a week or read occasionally once a month, once they start talking about a book that they enjoyed, they all talk about what we might call absorption. They talk about the fact that they can visualize the situation, they empathize with the main character, they can't stop turning the page, they are very engaged, they forget about other activities. And I think if we learned one thing from J.K. Rowling and all the Harry Potter books, it's that this experience of absorption is not something that's restricted to a small number of children who are growing up in well-educated homes. It's something that can appeal to a vast range of children. And so as psychologists and educators, I think it means that we shouldn't necessarily focus so much on individual differences among children in their emotion and motivation, but rather we should find contexts in which many children exhibit the kind of motivation and excitement that we would want children to display. And that means analyzing this phenomenon of absorption and extending it, of course, to other intellectual domains, whether it's mathematics or history. For the moment, our work is focusing on children's interest in fiction, but I think it does invite some interesting, new, and somewhat more optimistic thinking about how to keep children interested and motivated.
Wow, that's really good. Thank you so much. Well, on the chat, we have some questions. Because the time, I'm going to read, I think 2 of them.
Yeah.
Let's see. The first, how do you want it? Both at the same time, or first one you answer and then the other question?
Let's do one at a time, otherwise I'll forget the question.
Okay, so at the time, right?
One at a time, yeah.
Okay, so the first says, is there a relationship between children's tolerance for separation and their trust in what others say?
I'm just looking at it now, the question. Is there a relationship?
Did you listen?
Yes, I see it. I can see it.
Okay, all right. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, so the answer is yes, there is a relationship, but let me be a bit clearer about what the relationship is that we have found. So some years ago, in collaboration with an attachment researcher, we looked at children's willingness to trust a claim made by their mother as compared to a stranger. And what we found was that children tended to believe their mother over the stranger. However, when we look more carefully, the gap between mother and stranger depended a little bit, or not a little bit, it depended rather clearly on the attachment status of the child. So particularly when the mother said something that was unexpected or unlikely, securely attached children, as measured by the strange situation, were more likely to shift to the stranger's claim and to accept that. So in other words, somewhat paradoxically, the child who is securely attached is also the child who's prepared to be a little bit skeptical or questioning of a claim made by their parent. At the other extreme, we found children who were ambivalent, had an ambivalent attachment to their mother, who tended to trust her no matter whether what she said was plausible or not so plausible. And at the other extreme, we had children who had an avoidant relationship, who showed little preference for their mother over the stranger under any circumstances. So this is a rather long-winded answer. That was a first exploratory attempt to look at the relationship between the child's attachment and the child's willingness to trust claims made by attachment figures. But I think there's a good deal more to say in the future about that relationship. By no means did we, as it were, have we closed the book. And in particular, as I've expressed in this presentation, I'm not completely convinced that the strange situation is the best diagnostic tool for figuring out the child's relationship to a caregiver in any case, given the ambiguities that surround that. But broadly speaking, yes, we can see connections between whom the people that children trust and their attachment relationships. Yep.
Okay, thank you. Well, doctor, if you agree, I can read Dagnover's question in order to give them the same opportunity to ask. Dagnover says, how's the response and reaction from other children regarding the death from another classmate's parent?
That's a good question. And I think the short answer is that we don't know much about it. So in other words, a good deal of the research that's done on children and death has focused on children who have lost their own parent. Whereas what you are asking in this question is, how does the child respond to the parent who is the parent of a classmate? And I can speculate and loosely on the basis of seeing my own children as they were growing up deal with that situation, but I must admit I don't know of any systematic research on such reactions. Yeah, so a rather unsatisfactory answer, namely, we don't know.
Okay, so we have 5 minutes left. So if you agree, once again, I can read one of the 2 questions that we have here.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, let's see. Is it possible to develop despite death therapy based on children's ability to represent missing persons?
I'm tempted to say that that is possible. So what recent research on grief has shown is that, I'm now talking about research that's predominantly done with adults, that adults in the first 6 months or year or 18 months after a bereavement often report that the person they have lost, the person who has died, it feels to them from time to time as if that person remains present. It's as if the person is in the room or nearby. And what most adults report also is that the presence of that person is reassuring to them. It's not disturbing, it's reassuring. And I think that makes sense in the light of the claims that I've made earlier, namely that we are indeed used to carrying around this network in our mind, in our heads. And if anything, the ability to conjure up somebody and think about them in their absence is a kind of reinforcement or reestablishment or maintenance of the emotional tie. And so it wouldn't be very surprising if people who are facing loss and death allow that process to continue somewhat unchecked and uninhibited. And they report, as I've just said, that that's something that they find helps them come to terms with the loss that they've had. We know less about the extent to which children do this. Do children also feel that the parent that they've lost, for example, is in some sense still with them? And nor do we know much about the extent to which it would be good to have conversations about the missing parent. And I would personally be tempted to think that the maintenance of that lost person in the child's memory and thought processes is likely to be a good thing and to be ultimately of reassurance. We do know, of course, from historical accounts that often parents try to protect their children when another parent has died. The living parent may not necessarily talk about the parent who's died with the child. And indeed, Darwin himself was somebody who faced this situation. He was raised, if I recall correctly, predominantly by his father. And there's an interesting analysis by John Bowlby of the extent to which that meant that Darwin himself was deprived of an opportunity to grieve properly for the mother that he had lost. So, to cut a long story short, I would say that the findings I'm presenting and the analysis, the interpretation I'm offering, at least would allow one to make some suggestions about how to help children facing loss deal with the loss that they've undergone.
Okay, well, I think that's it for today because the time, most of the students that we're asking today, you're gonna have them tomorrow or from tomorrow to Saturday, which is really important for us and for them too. Doctor, thank you so much once again for being with us. I hope that you're gonna be with us next year too. So thank you, Hax, take care, and have a nice day. Thank you for everybody too. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.